I decided to move from Kentucky to Chicago, I truly underestimated the effect it would have on me as a person, especially on my views on many social and political issues. I grew up in a fairly conservative Christian home in Kentucky and grew up accepting the views that my parents held. When I moved to Chicago, a place with such an active aspect of social activism and protest, and movements like Black Lives Matter, the Women's March, trans rights, and so many more, I started to question stances I had on issues prior to moving and what I found important and right. This digital story is going to tell of my journey using an oral history project to find out if recent Chicago protests and activism have had an influential power on the political and social affiliations and experiences of other young adults also living in the north side of the city with a similar background and journey to the city as my own. I reached out to my peers and to the peers of my peers, and the response I got back told a story of its own. I had several offers from people to participate related to my research question. I started out interviewing someone, but due to scheduling issues, we were not able to finish the entire interview. I redid my interview with someone else, Kirsten Nickel, and found that these movements and protests in Chicago inspired and influenced her in such a way that I myself have not yet gotten to. After participating in these multiple interviews, I found that despite differing genders and identities, the social activism of Chicago had a similar influence on not just myself, but others as well. I also found my interviewees were not only influenced and changed by Chicago activism and protests, but felt so moved by them that they are bringing these ideologies back to their families and hometowns. This is something that I have been too scared to do myself, but I found that with Kirsten, she has been so changed by what she is seeing, experiencing, and participating in. She works to take this change and spread it outside the city limits. As she called it, building a bridge between the activism in the city and those outside of it who may not feel the effect or understand the message. I was finding advice from her words about how to become more involved and take what I've seen and experienced to others, especially to those back in my family and hometown. This is her experience of how living in the city changed her view on political and social issues, how she is working to bring these influences back to her family, and how she may one day reflect on these times in her life.
All around, we were all four of us were just much more conservative then. I mean, the political time was quite a bit different, so it's different than anything else right now. But so I would say, yeah, we were a little more conservative. I was very judgmental and just judged everybody for everything they did without thinking of anything more complex like societal pressures or economics or anything. And I also just hadn't seen a lot. I hadn't really seen what poverty looked like. So I think I was fast to judge people and didn't really understand. I thought I understood the world and social issues and thought I could tell people how to live their life, and that was problematic in all sorts of ways. And I look back and just shake my head. Yeah, so I think it was very much so a sense of because I got a good education, this was very much the sense of people around me is we were educated and we knew more than other people. And since moving out of that bubble and into Chicago, where there's so many different kinds of people, I've learned I know, also college, I've learned I know absolutely nothing. So, and I don't have the right to judge anybody. So, and that's definitely in bringing my experiences to my parents, they've definitely kind of followed suit and being oh, we don't know anything either. Good, yeah. So we've all very much so become way more open. And so it wasn't until I came to Chicago that I saw all of systematic oppression of people of color and what poverty really looked like, and started learning more about various issues in my classes. That I really was okay, there's a lot of work to be done, right? And started engaging more with local communities. The narrative of how we talk about we're talking about race now. We weren't talking about it pre-Ferguson. We weren't having these conversations about police brutality, about prison visits. We weren't talking about what racism looks like now. And so the fact that this is even something that is constantly brought up, I think is really important, and we need to acknowledge the work that those activists did, and like it's clearly had an effect because we can't stop talking about it.
Right.
We've also seen, I think there's like an increase in people of color in office, and a lot of people now watching the police. So I think there's still a lot of stuff that needs to change, but I think we've at least changed our like conversation, which I think is definitely worth mentioning. These people who never had to think about race are having to think about it. We are going to see people being able to change. And I'll use the example of my dad. My dad's not super conservative, but he did at the beginning of like when Ferguson was happening, and then the specific moment that I remember him being really angry about the protests where I think it was 2 Thanksgivings ago, a lot of Black Lives Matter protesters shut down airports, and they like would not let anybody board their flights. And we were on our way to Thanksgiving and listening to the news coverage on it, and my dad was getting so angry. He's like, I don't get why they have to ruin everybody's Thanksgiving. And he and I got into a screaming match about it, which was really fun on the way to Thanksgiving dinner. But you know, he was coming from that mindset of like, why are these people ruining Thanksgiving? Like, why are they doing this? And you know, I just kind of said, because their Thanksgivings are ruined because the kids are dead. Like, so like someone being delayed on their flight is not a big deal compared to a person dying. So it's making you think about, okay, why are these people ruining people's flights? Oh, because their child has been murdered. Like, and in that, he and I've talked about it since, and he said that like, he had never thought about any of the protests that way. And that since then, he's like, I actually get why this is an important movement. And so like, I think in those more conservative areas, now that like people are seeing the protests are happening and seeing that people are angry, it takes just like people going to tease out, why are you angry? And this is why they're doing it. And then it can bring people over. Well, one, because I think like, I'll be proud of myself for just doing what I believe in. I think that's important. And like, even, you know, now, like, and even people who do things I don't necessarily always agree with, I'm happy that they're doing what they believe in. And like, I think I'll be able to look back definitely at that with pride. But again, I don't like, based on the marches I've been to, like, it's been trans rights, it's been, you know, Black, like anti-police brutality, Black Lives Matter, it's been Women's March, it's been anti-Trump. And so like, all of these things are like pretty obvious issues to me. And so I can't see myself looking back and be like, I shouldn't have supported like Black Lives Matter because they wanted, you know, like prison reform, which like I desperately want prison reform because my brother's in prison. And like to like support people not being murdered. Like, I don't think I'll ever look back and be like, what was I doing? I think that like at the moment, the issues I'm engaged with are so polarizing. I think if I was like, if these things that I've chosen to march with are definitely not something I'll regret.